And former Vice President Joe Biden will take the stage. Tonight's showdown gives voters the last chance to see the pair head-to-head before the November 3rd election day. All right, here's the details. The debate will be moderated by NBC News White House correspondent Kristen Welker. It's being held at Belmont University in Nashville, Tennessee. And just like the first debate, the entire event will run 90 minutes, divided into 15-minute sections covering 6 topics. In an effort to cut down on fighting between the candidates, the Commission on Presidential Debates will now allow microphones to be cut off during the initial 2-minute answer for each topic because it's supposed to be uninterrupted. The mics will be on, however, during the open discussion portion that follows. Now, tonight's 6 topics are fighting COVID-19, American families, race in America, climate change, national security, and leadership. The debates are usually a way for candidates to reach voters before Election Day, but the number of people across the country who haven't made up their minds yet, who haven't already cast their ballot, it's dwindling. In Illinois alone, the State Board of Elections reports nearly 860,000 mail-in ballots have already been returned. Adding on in-person early voters, more than 1,373,000 Illinoisans have already weighed in as of yesterday. Joining me tonight to talk about all of this, Suzanne Chad, Associate Professor of Political Science at North Central College, and Bill Muck, Chair of the North Central College Department of Political Science. So you guys work together every day, and thanks for joining me. Always good to see you. And Suzanne, let me start with you. Look, tonight essentially are the closing arguments for these guys, right? But I have to ask you, what is the point? You just heard me say so many people have voted already, so much going on. What do we need to know more about these guys that we don't already know?
It really does seem like there's not a whole lot left to learn about the two of them, right? But it is important in these last couple of weeks. There are still some people who have not decided yet. There are people who have not cast their votes yet. There are people who have decided and have yet to vote, and these debates can mobilize certain voters to go out for someone and, quite honestly, to go out against somebody. So even if we don't learn anything new necessarily about the candidates, it is an opportunity for the candidates to make that last pitch to the voters, even the ones that have already been persuaded, to actually go out and either put that ballot in the mail, drop it off in the drop box, or go to the polls.
So, Bill, if we're looking for a win tonight, you know, I'm going to be on air. We're all going to be on air afterwards talking about who won this thing. How will we know? What's a win for each of these candidates?
I think a win for Donald Trump is if people are saying he did a nice job, right? I mean, the last debate for Trump was really a disaster. He undermined, he got in his own way all the time. So I think he's got to, if he's even, right? If you feel like at the end of the day, he and Biden feel like similar candidates, I think the campaign would say that's a win for us. He's had so much trouble over the last couple of weeks of undermining his own message, not having good campaign discipline. So I think if he comes out and everybody says, oh, it feels like the vice presidential debate where both seem like legitimate candidates, I think the Trump campaign can say that's a win. You
know, Suzanne, in fact, it's been well known that Trump's advisors for this debate have encouraged him to let Joe Biden talk, stop interrupting him. Now, part of that is because a lot of people turned on Trump as a result of that in the last debate and thought he lost because of it. But what do you, as a strategy, do you think that, you know, letting Joe Biden talk gets him into trouble, or is it really just about keeping the president under control?
Yeah, you know, there is this narrative, particularly coming from the Trump advisors and some of the Republican media, that let Biden speak and he will fumble, he will lose his train of thought, he'll get in his own way, and the president just kind of sits back and does nothing. I think that's not the smartest strategy, because the presumption then, I don't think it's a smart presumption to assume that Biden can't hold a thought for 2 minutes. We know that that's not the case. And so I think, you know, a disciplined President Trump in the debate, thinking that it's going to lead to Biden saying things he shouldn't say or misstepping, I think is actually miscalculation for the president. I think it would benefit Biden to have that uninterrupted 2 minutes, which, you know, having the microphone muted is beneficial for those watching. But the president can still interrupt and Biden can still hear that. And so that could lead to Biden even feeling interrupted, even though those mics are muted.
Yeah, and what you just said is really, Bill, what I wanted to pose to you, because, yes, the microphones will be muted. I don't think that stops the president. In fact, not only will Biden hear him, but, you know, we may even hear some of that picked up on the microphone, although, you know, now they've added in plexiglass, and maybe that's a good barrier as well. But if you're advising the president, would you say, look, with the muted mic, just don't do it? Or do you think, no, go for it, try and unnerve Biden, because that's the point?
Well, the other thing is, I think whatever the campaign says to him, I don't think Trump is going to listen. I think Trump has convinced himself that he knows better than others, and he really feels like that if he gets under Biden's skin, as Suzanne said, there's going to be a mistake. He's going to look old. He's going to look feeble. So I think he's convinced that's a good strategy. Also, President Trump wants to look strong, and he's convinced himself that by interjecting, talking over Biden, that he dominates the debate. Now, the polling suggests that the public isn't looking for that, especially those those few undecided voters. They're looking for issues. They're looking for conversation about COVID. But the president has a very, very different perspective on all of that.
Let's talk a little bit about how each will get under the other one's skin. Suzanne, obviously, the way you get under Joe Biden's skin, and this was true even when he was a senator, you go after his character, you go after his family, that unnerves him. Now, the difference now is that for the last 4 days or so, since Sunday, we haven't seen him. He's been preparing. I'm guessing he's ready for anything that could come at him on that topic, but I still think it unnerves him.
Yes, whether Kristen Welker decides to bring it up or not, and I think it's a safe bet that she will not bring up the New York Post story and the situation now about this found laptop, Hunter Biden's found laptop, that the president is going to bring it up at every possible opportunity, particularly the section about foreign policy. The president has been waiting for a foreign policy debate. And so the fact that the moderator, Kristen Welker, decided to make that one of the 6 topics, I think the president is going to bring this up repeatedly. And what Joe Biden can do, and I think he did this very well in the first debate, is be the protective father while also defending his own character to say, first of all, don't go after my son. And second of all, there is no evidence to suggest that this has any merit whatsoever. And let's focus on the actual issues of foreign policy. And the president isn't going to roll over and let that go. I think it's going to be a fight between the two of them. But I actually think Joe Biden comes out on top in this if this fight occurs.
So, Suzanne, I'm going to stay with you because you just talked about foreign policy. That is what the president wanted to talk about. But the topic Welker picked is national security. I know there's an overlap there, but do you expect Trump to just take it into the world of foreign policy? Because questions on national security, that can be Russia and Iran going after the election, those kind of things. It may not be a foreign policy discussion as she presents it.
That's a good point. And Bill, as a foreign policy expert, I will defer to him on that. But if I'll answer just the question real quickly and then defer to Bill, is I think that President Trump, no matter how Kristen Welker poses the questions, is absolutely going to take it to China and Burisma and Hunter Biden and Joe Biden's potential involvement.
Okay, Bill, I'm sure you agree with that. Those aren't necessarily, well, they could be national security issues. But of course, if you're Joe Biden, I imagine you'd respond by, I'm not the one who has bank accounts in China that we didn't know about and have never been disclosed. What is your take on how these two will play off the national security topic and, at least on Trump's part, turn it into a foreign policy discussion?
Well, I think any kind of discussion of international politics plays to both of them. So Trump, I think Trump initially, when the topics were released, he said he wanted more foreign policy, more national security issues. He wants to talk about China, but I think Biden would do well also. I mean, he also is very well versed in foreign policy and national security issues. I think at the last the town hall, Biden's best answer was a question about foreign policy, asking about Trump's record. I mean, he was able to go on in a whole bunch of detail about things where Trump has struggled, but at the same time, Trump also wants to talk about national security issues because he feels like he can go on the offensive, talking about the Middle East, talking about his relationship with China. So I think both of them really would be comfortable if the conversation moves in that direction.
Both these guys are obviously up for a lot of tough questions, stacking the cord and COVID, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But for now, let me ask you to hang with me. I'm going to come back to you in just a moment. The debate starts, looking at my clock, or the clock in Suzanne's world. It's about 20 minutes from now. And fortunately, WGN political reporter Taman Bradley, he's live in Nashville tonight. He's got more on what we can expect. Hey, Taman.
Hey, Paul, good evening from Nashville, Music City. Tonight, the men who want to be president will play their greatest hits as the campaign nears the finish line. For President Trump and Vice President Biden, this is it. The final presidential debate, a final shot to make their case to a massive television audience. The 90-minute face-to-face takes place at Belmont University in Music City. Strict COVID safety protocols remain in effect.
The radical left, will you shut up, man?
Listen, not exactly a sweet sound at the first presidential debate. There were nonstop interruptions and crosstalk. In response, the debate commission has tweaked tonight's format. Each candidate will have 2 minutes to speak uninterrupted at the beginning of each segment, and the other candidate's mic will be turned off. President Trump takes the stage following a dust-up this week with 60 Minutes. The president left an interview taping. Upset with Leslie Stahl, today he posted the unedited sit-down on his Facebook page.
With you, nothing I said would be any good less. I think we have enough of an interview here. Okay, that's enough. Let's go.
President Trump also criticized tonight's moderator, Kristen Welker of NBC. Likely to come up tonight, either from Welker or President Trump, questions about Biden's son, Hunter. President Trump's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, has been shopping a story about a laptop containing files showing Hunter Biden's business dealings in Ukraine. Meanwhile, President Trump could address reports he maintained foreign bank accounts, including one in China. This week on the campaign trail, the rhetoric sharpened.
We cannot afford 4 more years of this, Philadelphia.
He will massively raise your taxes. He won't even know he's doing it, by the way, but let's go into it.
The final debate comes amid concerns about election integrity. National security officials announced yesterday that both Iran and Russia have obtained American voter registration data. Iran, officials announced, has used the information to send faked emails to voters. But there's no indication election results have been changed. More than 46 million Americans have already cast their ballots, and for months there really hasn't been much movement in the polls. So tonight, Paul, is a final opportunity to shake things up.
And Taman, let me pick up on that because so many people have voted already. It raises the question, which is, are we in for just a 90-minute show tonight? Or do you think either of these guys is really looking to change some minds? What's the discussion afterwards going to be, do you think?
Wow. Well, you know, President Trump's advisors certainly want him to tone it down. They don't want him to be as aggressive as he was at the first presidential debate. Keep in mind that for months, the Republicans have been telling us that Joe Biden is older. He may not be as aware as he used to be. And so if any of that is true, they need to show that. And so President Trump needs to step back, actually allow Joe Biden to answer some of the questions. And the rules should lend to Biden being able to finish his thoughts. Trump as well doing the same thing. But that's usually not the president's style, as you know, Paul.
Yeah, all right, Taman Bradley, we'll see you on the news tonight with your report. Thanks for being with me, as always, my friend. Be safe.
Sure.
And a new Quinnipiac University poll shows former Vice President Joe Biden holding a wide lead over President Trump. With just under 2 weeks to go, Biden has a 10-point advantage, with 51% of likely voters saying they'll vote for him. President Trump trails with 41%. That margin almost exactly the same as a poll taken back in September. The most recent results show white voters are nearly split, with Trump up 3 points. Seniors, they're largely supporting Joe Biden, giving him a 16-point lead. We're still with Suzanne Chad and Bill Muck, both professors from North Central College. Bill, let me start with you. First of all, you just heard me give some poll results. So there's a lot of Democrats out there who are losing sleep saying, I think you said that 4 years ago. And that's not what we woke up to. Is there anything, and plus national polls, forget them. All you want to look at are battleground states. Should Democrats or Biden supporters feel more comfortable this year than they did 4 years ago?
I think they should, but they won't, right? The reality is everybody's going to be nervous. You know, the polls are different this year. You know, Biden has a bigger lead nationally, and then the state by state and the swing polls, he's doing really well. His lead is bigger than Hillary Clinton's was. So I think that's important. But at the same time, turnout is really good. So there are a lot of reasons why Democrats in the Biden campaign should feel really good about this. There are fewer undecided voters, which makes the polls stronger. The state by state polls have done a better job of polling white, non-college educated voters as well. So there's a lot of reasons to think that the polls may be more accurate this time than in 2016, and turnout seems to be much higher as well. So I think, you know, even though they're going to be nervous, I think they're in a good place.
Suzanne, you know, as you look at the polls, most of the analysts, and almost everybody will tell you we're not going to know the results on election night. I certainly understand that reasoning. But I want to toss this at you. It is hard to see how President Trump wins re-election without winning Florida. If Joe Biden does win Florida on election night, even though we don't know the overall landscape of things, is it over?
Oh my goodness, you did throw me that one. That's a great question. And you know, the answer I think is no. While there are a lot of different scenarios in which Biden can win without Florida, Ohio is one of the states, for example, that he would have to win. I don't think that it's over necessarily, mostly because, you know, normally we look at about 5 swing states. We've broadened that to look at 7 or 8 at this point. And so the path to 270 actually looks a little bit different than it has before. I also would add that even if we end up in a, you know, hanging Chad 2000 type of situation with counting the ballots and all this in different states, that the litigation we would expect to see, particularly from Republicans who already have lawyers on the ground in all of these states, they're not going to concede and give up, even if a state like Florida might be called for Biden. So I don't think that we're likely to see this end with a concession, even if Florida gets called, let's say, for Biden.
So, Bill, let's tap into some of the issues. New study today comes out from Columbia regarding COVID-19 pandemic, pointing to the administration's failures, their study on masking and testing, and basically saying we could have saved over 100,000 lives had the administration done it differently. That being said, and I don't know how many people will know about that study before the debate starts, but President Trump has been known to just blame China, and in his recent rallies this week, it's all people talk about COVID, COVID, COVID. We rounded the turn. Is that strategy problematic for him this time?
When we look at the polls, the issue that comes, over and over and over again, what the people say they're most concerned about is COVID, and they want a plan for solving this problem. And President Trump's strategy has been to blame and deflect and point the finger at China and say that we're right around the corner, we're going to be finishing with this, and it's just not having the electoral impact in the polls that he needs. So, if I was advising him, I would say you need to hit this problem head on, talk about what you're going to do, return to the days where you were coming up with plans and being sophisticated, get the vice president out there. I think he needs to go on the aggressive. He's spending a lot of time trying to shift the attention to Joe Biden and talk about Biden's flaws. People don't really care about that. What they care about is how the country is handling COVID or not handling it. So I think him confronting this problem directly would help him in these final days.
So the flip side of that, Suzanne, which is, undecideds and certainly Trump supporters, they're all worried about the economy. And I'm going to guess that President Trump will say this guy is going to shut down your economy and you're going to see depression like you've never seen before and all of that. The truth is Joe Biden does have to be careful because he does say he'll follow the scientists. And that gets interpreted as he may just shut down the economy. How does Joe Biden handle this?
Yeah, this is a delicate dance in some ways that Biden has, particularly for what the reason you just suggested is that President Trump, and to Bill's point, is going to continue to deflect and say Biden wants to shut it down. He's going to shut it down. He's going to shut it down, and then point to things as he's done before about the increase in domestic violence and drinking, drugs, and suicide, to talk about the ways in which shutting down the economy has detrimental health effects, where he said things like the cure can't be worse than the problem. And so for Joe Biden, I think what he needs to continue to do, and he did this very well in the first debate, is look directly at the camera and appeal to the American people to say, your health has been at risk. This president has failed you. I have a plan in place that will both keep your livelihoods going and your lives going. And if he stays on that message, no matter what the president throws at him, I think that's where he sees success.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that looking in the camera thing, we pointed that out at that first debate, which was it's so obviously something he was trained to do. It also helps him break away from Trump. Bill, if Biden's people, I have a clip for you from one of Trump's rallies, because if Biden's people were wondering how might he get attacked, all you got to do is watch a rally to find out. And here's the kind of thing the Biden's people would have heard the president say.
Postpone the vaccine, prolong the pandemic, close your schools, and shut down our country. And that's what he'll do. He will massively raise your taxes. He won't even know he's doing it, by the way, but let's go into it. He has no clue, but that's all right. Bury you in regulations, dismantle your police departments, dissolve our borders, confiscate your guns. That would be happening very quickly.
So, Bill, I don't know who believes it, but those people believe it. The people with the president and those rallies sure believe it. What about undecideds out there? The president is persuasive when he presents these points.
He is, and he's on message when he does that. And I think that what we'll see in the election is whether people want an open economy. Do they want to move more quickly with opening the economy, getting back to work, or would they rather see a more direct effort addressing COVID so that you can open up down the road? And I think both camps are making different arguments. Trump is arguing, let's open up, the cure can't be worse than the disease, let's get back to work. And Biden is saying, let's address the problem that is COVID, and then once we do that, then the economy will come back. And the election will give us a sense of which argument is more compelling.
So, Suzanne, but probably Biden's toughest moment is going to be how he handles the stacking the court. It's something he has not answered. He keeps asking. He said, I'll give you my answer before Election Day. Well, fortunately, CBS in their upcoming 60 Minutes interview gave a little leak about that answer of what Biden's answer was. And basically, he says he's going to appoint a bipartisan commission to study the issue. Republicans, Democrats, conservatives, liberals, give him 180 days and then come back and tell him what to do, because there's many ways one can, fix the courts. Is that a dodge, or is he right on?
So I will say, as a political scientist, and I think a lot of us in the community don't think that packing the court in this way is a good idea. It's playing politics with an institution that is supposed to be above politics. And the court has been used this way for a long time. In fact, Biden said it himself, the court is being used as a football between the branches and between the parties, which was not what it was intended to do. And so while I do think that he and Kamala Harris had dodged the question previously, and politically I understand why, this solution that he is positing, I think, is the best possible solution for this. It's not a smart idea to jump to say, here's rhetoric that one side of the community really likes, and so we're going to talk about stacking the court. We're going to look at what is the problem that we think needs addressing. Let's bring everybody to the table and see what we can do to make this institution work in the way that it is intended to. I think this is the best possible solution for the problem that has become the court as a political tool.
So, Bill, here's the thing. For people, the folks who aren't lawyers, you guys are political scientists, but this is not in the Constitution, so changing the number of justices on the Supreme Court is doable. It'd be an act of Congress. But my question for you is this. President Trump has he really has reshaped the judiciary, appointing over 200 judges, all conservatives. As a lawyer, I will say some clearly not qualified, because you just see that in terms of their background. Some of them didn't even know what a motion was. But that being said, he's reshaped the judiciary. So is it or is it not fair for Joe Biden to step in and say, look, there's more than one way to pack a court. Adding judges is one, but take a look at the landscape. It's not fair to America right now.
And I think part of the reason why I agree with this, what he's doing, it's a good idea to say, let's have a real conversation. Let's bring in some experts, some Democrats and Republicans, and let's talk about not just how we get the Democrats to get an advantage in the Supreme Court, because that doesn't change anything. Even though, if the Republicans have an advantage now, we're not in any better situation if Democrats pack the court and then they have an advantage. It will just be back and forth. So let's, there are real options out there. Let's have a conversation. Let's put together a bipartisan commission to think about this. So I was pleased to see that he was suggesting that. I think part of it is a dodge, right? He doesn't want to really answer that question, but it is meaningful. And you're right that the way the court is moving, it is going to be increasingly perceived as partisan. And that's not good for anybody, right? We already have a president who's partisan. We have a Congress that's perceived as partisan and doesn't have a lot of support. So we want to retain the integrity of that institution. So let's find a way to address that problem so that it doesn't perpetually come up.
All right. One very quick question for each of you. Suzanne, what strategies would you recommend these candidates follow in the, after tonight, after the next 11 days to go?
Well, I've often joked that whatever we might recommend to President Trump, for example, is probably not what he's going to follow. Yeah. So what I would recommend for President Trump is to lay off the attacks, because in fact what we've seen from polling is that it is increasing the favorabilities towards Biden. I think he needs to focus on, here's what I have done and here's what I will do. Stop talking about emails, stop talking about the Bidens, start talking about what he's going to do.
Okay.
And Joe Biden needs to do exactly what he's already been doing. Okay. Talking about what he's going to do.
And I'm sorry to be short with you. And Bill, very quickly, we won't have an election. If we don't have results on election night, what sentence can you tell people to calm them down until we find out the results?
Just listen to your state government, listen to the process. This is a normal thing. A lot of countries do this where it takes multiple days. This is just a new thing for the United States. It's perfectly fine. It doesn't mean that there's any fraud or corruption. It's just the process playing out in a new format. All
right, Professor Bill Muck, Professor Suzanne Chad, thanks for being with me as always. I'm going to come take a class from you guys, but I don't want to pay tuition. Thank you, guys.
Anytime.
All right.
Thank you.
Congresswoman Robin Kelly represents Illinois' 2nd District, covering parts of the city's south side, south suburbs. She's long been a supporter of Joe Biden. She's joining us live now to talk about what the campaign expects when the former vice president takes the stage. Just a few minutes. Congresswoman Kelly, welcome back. Good to talk to you.
Good to talk to you. Good to see you.
So let me ask you, what your expectations? You've heard us talking. You heard all this stuff going on. What expectations do you have for the vice president tonight as he faces a president who most likely will throw jabs and barbs at him?
Well, I think that the vice president will speak directly to the American people like he tried to do before. He'll speak about his plans for COVID. He'll speak about his plans for the economy. He'll speak about his plans to bring people back to work. So I'm hoping that, he'll just focus on the American people and talk about what he and Senator Harris want to do and not, fall for the president's jabs and underhanded things that he might say, but I'm sure Vice President Biden will do fantastic.
But one of the when the vice president gets uncomfortable, it's when he gets personal jabs or jabs on his family. That would be true for anybody, I think. So the whole Hunter Biden thing is going to get thrown at him. And here's the thing: that New York Post story, which is yet to be verified by the New York Times or by the Wall Street Journal or by other reputable news, Washington Post. Nobody's verified it except New York Post. But that being said, is it sufficient for the vice president just to say it's a hoax, you're making it up, move on? Because there are people who believe it.
Well, that's what the president says all the time, that things are a hoax. I mean, Vice President Biden is trying to concentrate on what he wants to do for America to build back better. And it's just, I think it's underhanded to throw something his son may or may not have done at him like he tried to do before. And if he says that it's not true, I believe him that he says it's not true.
So the vice president has been in debate prep for the last 4 days since Sunday, but the truth is the campaign took some flack on Saturday and on the Sunday morning shows because he wasn't anywhere to be seen on Saturday. He basically took the day off the campaign trail. And one of the questions raised to, I know, one of his surrogates, friend of yours, Chris Coons, was really 2 weeks out from the debate and the vice president's taking a day off while the president is visiting all of these cities. Was that a mistake?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think that if he wanted to prepare for the debate, that's fine to prepare for the debate. Vice President Biden has been working hard. He's been touching base with all the places he needs to touch base with. So, if he didn't do well in the debate, people would have talked about that. So I don't think that was a mistake for him to take off. And also, soon-to-be Vice President Harris was visiting different places and campaigning and that kind of thing. So they were covered.
And by the way, what sense do you have? We've already seen the one debate the vice president candidate will have. Is she helping that ticket? Is she going to bring people out, the black community, the Latino community, young people? Because that's who Obama was after yesterday.
Oh, I definitely think she'll bring all kind of people out. She's a smart woman. She'll be a great vice president. Yes, I think she'll bring women out. I think she'll bring people of color out. But I think she'll bring all kind of people out that agree with what they want to do and what they want to accomplish for this country. All
right, Congresswoman Robin Kelly, the 2nd District, please make some popcorn, sit back, because I know what you're doing tonight. Enjoy the debate. We'll talk to you after. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. We did reach out, by the way, to local Republicans to participate in this pre-show, but did not receive a response. All right, that's it for us on this half hour. Don't go anywhere, because the second presidential debate starts in just a few minutes. Now, you can watch it right here, or go to the TV and go to WGN Channel 9. We're going to carry the debate here in full through 9:30. After the debate is over, you can catch my analysis with my friends Micah Mater and Ray Cortopassi. If you miss anything, we'll have a full recap on the WGN News at 10 with Taman Bradley live in Nashville. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you in a moment.